Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. It's Sustainable Outcomes, and we're going to be looking back at two of the most thought-provoking sessions from the Construction Leaders Summit, which happened recently. My name's Lee Jones, the head of Manufacturer Solutions at MBS, and amongst many strings of my bow, I've got a master's in sustainable architecture. Sustainability is a big passion of mine, and it's something that's got clear focus throughout the industry. And internally within MBS as well, obviously our tools such as Chorus and Source are helping specifiers and manufacturers to communicate better and allow these sustainable measures and decisions to be made much more effectively. I'm going to be talking to you today as a top and tail of two previous sessions, and what we're going to cover will be explained in a moment. But for anybody that's not familiar with who MBS are, MBS is a platform that connects the construction industry. We provide specification tools and ways and means of providing products and system information with relation to manufacturers' products. So our customers are amongst architects, contractors, engineers, civils and landscape professionals, etc., but also construction product manufacturers as well, where we can allow manufacturers to actually list and promote their products directly within the specification environment. What we're going to see today is the presentation that was presented by Gary Clark. Gary is an architect from HOK, and he's also the chair of the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes organization. We're going to hear a panel session as well. This was one that was hosted by Richard Waterhouse, and that features Gary. It also features Taleen Josefsson from Chetwoods. Taleen is a USA-based architect, but is currently working here in the UK, and she is leading sustainable measures within Chetwoods. We're also going to hear from Judit Kimpian. Judit is the chair of the Architects Council of Europe's Sustainable Architecture Group, amongst many other things in being a qualified architect, with a very, very clear understanding and passion for sustainability. And lastly, but not least, we're going to hear from Scott Blance. Scott is a consultant for the Sustainable Energies Group. I'll then do a bit of a wrap up and summary, so we'll do a brief review of what we've seen and what we've heard, and then we'll give you a bit of call to action and let everybody get on with the day. So, without further ado, here is the presentation from Gary Clark. Enjoy.
Right, going to go straight into this. Welcome to the talk. I'm going to be giving an overview of the RIBA guidance, and then how we can actually sort of deliver a year or a decade of climate action. And obviously it's good timing. This is Earth Day as well, so the next 10 years is absolutely critical. Quick recap in terms of actually what's happening. The climate change, as we know about, it's 37 billion tonnes were emitted in 2018, a third of that from buildings and construction around the world. That's 40% in the UK, and the Earth at its best can only absorb half that amount, but that is debatable. It could be a lot less. At the same time, we're deforesting the planet at the fastest rate as ever, and we can see an image of Amazon here. The net result is actually the future. We've got two paths. The path to the right is actually a future of, we can see this is an old scale Fahrenheit, but it's about 8 degrees Fahrenheit change. That's about 4 degrees temperature centigrade. So that's the future, and we can see that the impacts of that 1.1 degrees temperature change on the climate events, things that happen every 100 years are now happening regularly. So we've got to do something about it, as we know. If we go as fast in terms of the 2% reduction per year for the next 30 years, then hopefully we can achieve that 2 degrees temperature increase. This is to the left. And if we go faster this next 10 years, then we can maybe achieve the limit of 1.5 degrees. Let's see how we can do that. Now, the RIBA, we've, as chair of the RIBA Sustainable Future Group, I've been active in terms of editing and writing these guides. First one we're going to go through is the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes, which then feeds into the 2030 challenge, and all that then feeds into the plan of work, which was released last year. And we've got a new guide that was released last month, which is the Plan for Use Guide. All these guides link back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all 17. And we can see them all here. Now, it's important to stress that actually all 17 are absolutely important, and we should consider those in whatever we do. But what we've done is at the RIBA, we split these up into two parts. So we've initially focused on the environmental sustainability issues, and we can see here. But actually, there's going to be a new report from the RIBA released later this year on the ethical side of sustainability. So just to make you aware that that's still coming through. That 10 has been distilled down into 8 sustainable outcomes, and this is the ones I'm going to touch on briefly, just go around this circle. So first one is net zero operational carbon, which is our kind of key target. This is kilowatt hours per square meter. Now, there's no shortage of energy hitting us. It's from the sun. The problem is, how do we capture and how do we store it? The key principles we're asking architects, designers, and specifiers. The first thing, and you'll see this a lot, is actually we can't solve the problem by building just new buildings. We've got to retrofit what we have. We've got 45 million buildings in existence in the UK, and we've got some of the most poorly performing stock in Europe. So if we're going to retrofit or we're going to build new, then fabric first approach is really what we're asking people to do, really focusing on the external envelope of the building and making sure that it's airtight and highly insulated. Then we actually then integrate regenerative engineering. This is thermal recovery systems, LED lighting with switching, but very simple. We don't want to overcomplicate the buildings in terms of what they need to do. Then we actually integrate as much on-site renewables as possible, but we don't obviously over-egg that. And then really it's making sure that in this whole thing of offsetting, we really do encourage people to offset in terms of clients to then balance that and create the net zero emissions. Then moving on to net zero embodied carbon, the Japanese temple really sums up what we're talking about here, which is a circular economy. It's taking natural low embodied materials as close to the building as possible, and then design for disassembly. So some of these Japanese temples are rebuilt every 20 years. And we see here, so retrofit first in terms of, again, circular economy, local and low embodied materials, healthy and ethical materials, and ethical is stressed. That will come to the fore later this year, and whole life carbon analysis. Next one is sustainable water cycle, and really what we got here is going beyond what we do now, which is low flow appliances and leak detection, and we're really asking the industry to take a step change and actually create rainwater recycling attenuation for every project. That will help to kind of take the pressure off the infrastructure and then help with some of our alluvial flooding issues. And at the same time, we create natural aquatic habitats in our cities. Next one is sustainable conductivity and transport. Obviously very topical just now. We're all meeting virtually, and really that kind of sums up the kind of hierarchy of what we need to do. We've got to think about how we work in terms of a blended learning, as our blended remote working plan, thinking about where we place our buildings in terms of proximity to public transport, and then what we've got to do in terms of our cities is creating high quality pedestrian links. Think about the end of journey experience for our commuters, and really trying to get everybody to move away from cars. And then the final thing really is thinking about electric vehicles. We can't solve the problem if we all buy Teslas. Okay, so that's the last thing we should think about. Next one is sustainable land use and ecology. This is actually really same thing here, retrofit, but actually from a brownfield site. Really, there's so much kind of sort of previous developed land that we've got to make that a priority, and we're really lobbying government for that. And the principle really is leave the site with better ecology, and we're asking for a 20% net increase in biodiversity as a minimum for all new projects, and that obviously aligns with the London plan. And at the same time, creating productive food landscapes, as you can see, there's children here. Next one is good health and well-being. Again, absolutely topical at the moment. And so this is a restaurant in St. James Park, which I did when I was at Hopkins, and really kind of sums up really kind of the principles, which is contact outside, contact in nature. It's creating that kind of appropriate density in terms of when we return to work. Indoor air quality is absolutely now top of the agenda. We understand we're slowly killing ourselves in our buildings in terms of if we don't get that right. Good lighting and good adaptive thermal comfort, acoustics, and obviously inclusivity as well. But we've got to go beyond the buildings. We've got to think and remember that we are actually creating places for people and actually communities. We're building communities. Greenwich Square at King's Cross is, for me, one of the best new squares in London for the last, in my lifetime anyway. And it's a joy to be in. And really, these kind of sort of basic principle of urban design really is at the core here. It's creating a mixed use and tenure, really sort of changing the idea of zoning. We've got to create identity and territory, creating that secure but yet social spaces. And it's all about that permeability and that high quality pedestrian links that we talked about to encourage people to feel safe in terms of our cities. And the final thing is in terms of capital cost, and really this is kind of debunking this myth, and this is really the focus. I'm sure it's going to be in the chat as well. We've got to live on the interest of the planet and not its capital, and that's really follows through into our buildings as well. So we've got to balance. We've got to look at the whole life analysis. We've got to balance the energy costs, the capital costs of materials, but also the operational costs. The more complex we make our buildings, the more it takes money it takes to run them. So we've got to look at that kind of balance in the costs with the added value, and really the added value of health and well-being that we create for our occupants, and also the kind of the social value of our kind of developments. And if you balance that, or maybe hopefully the kind of added value outweighs that, and then you get that return on your investment, that's really what we're looking for from our kind of sort of buildings going forward. So that's all the outcomes. And then really in the plan of work, this is a kind of diagram of how we actually sort of see this kind of working. Really setting your outcomes at the beginning with your client. If you're a designer, if you're a client, then actually this is what you're asking your architects to do, really sort of. And the sustainable outcomes is really just a starter for 10. It really is just to give you an idea in terms of the key outcomes and maybe some of the key metrics. There's about 25 metrics within the outcomes. You set these at your beginning, at the process, stage 0 and 1. And then we're integrating that into the design in stages 2 and 3. And then we flip into a kind of reality checking and obviously testing role, validation role within the stages 4 and 5 when we hand over to the contractor. But crucially, this is the thing, and the new plan of work is really changing and really defining how we hand over the building and how we actually sort of gather that feedback. Now, feedback has been part of the plan of work for 60 years, but it's been very sort of seldom used on a regular basis from our design teams, and we're going to change that. So end of stage 6, we are now proposing that there's a light touch POE at the end of 6, which is the defect liability period, and really feeding that back, that data back into our construction industry. So I'm going to focus on this last 3 here, and this relates to our new guide, which is the plan for use. This is an architect's version of soft landings, if you know the concept of soft landings. And really what we're trying to highlight here is designing with a user outcome in mind, not just the kind of input specification. There's a graduated approach to post-occupancy evaluation embedded in this document. As we talked about, a light touch review at the end of stage 6, and really this isn't rocket science. This is a very structured walk around your buildings to see how they're actually perform in reality, reading the meters, and then a light touch user survey just to kind of understand how the users are actually bedding in, how they're actually working with the building. If anything is not quite right, that's the end of that kind of process. And really, you know, again, there's a difference between a fine tuning and a defect. If there's something that needs more research, there's a diagnostic assessment in year 2, and then a more detailed investigation in year 3, as we see it. Not all aligns with our post-occupancy evaluation techniques. Now, this is our challenge. This is really what we've set. If we do nothing, we're at 4 degrees centigrade, which we see the impact of that. The UK government, obviously, have been very interesting this week. Obviously, 2050 was the net zero, but they're actually not doing a straight line. They're going faster, and then hopefully then that will kind of give them a bit more space. So it's all welcome, but we need a bit more detail on how they're going to do that. We certainly have got some ideas. So the main thing is we think in terms of the RBA, and that's been joined by leading developers and leading councils around the UK, that 2030, this next 10 years, is the main issue. Now, what we're saying really is we can't build any new or deep retrofitted unsustainable buildings after that date, because we need that 20 years to really deal with our existing building stock. And then really we set 10 years because that allows 2 or 3 cycles or iterations of design process so that we can upskill the professional or everybody on the call here, and upskill the kind of supply chain as well. And really, but the key thing here is we can't wait to 2030 to start it. You've got to have a go now, because you've got to iterate. So we're really encouraging everybody to put forward a net zero proposition to a client and to the supply chain. And then really, it's really testing if it is possible at this time in terms of the capital and economic cost. So we can see that's the balance. Now, going into the targets, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically what it comes down to is 4 of our sustainable outcomes we focused on. First one is operational energy, and we can see there we've used current benchmarks, and what we're saying is we're just reducing a percentage at a time, so it's very top-down calculation. And really at 2025, it would be a 50% reduction based on benchmarks, this is for domestic, and at 2030, it would be a 75% reduction, and then allowing people to sort of then offset that final 25%. And we think this is going to be doable within a domestic situation. Embodied carbon, similar principle there. From it's about 70% reduction from 1,000 kilograms CO2 per meter squared to about 300. So we can see that. And again, same thing there. We think it is challenging, but it's doable. Potable water use, it's a 40% reduction, and that aligns with actually that final step in terms of 2030 is actually rainwater storage and reuse. And then we can't create any unintended consequences. Hence, we've really highlighted that the health metrics are absolutely critical there, and we can see there that we've got overheating in terms of the SIBC. That should be SIBC TM22, 52, sorry, which is the adaptive comfort strategy. We've got daylighting levels, we've got CO2 levels as well, we've got total VOCs, which is becoming obviously in terms of indoor quality. We understand the cocktail effect there, and formaldehyde is there, so you can see some of the references. So we're not reinventing the wheel, we're not adding new targets, we're just taking from current best practice round about the industry. These targets will be revised later this year in terms of more sectorized, but I think domestic ones are a good starting point. Moving to non-domestic, we can see here slightly different benchmarks. We can see a DEC D rated. This is the average. The reason we've done that is obviously non-domestic buildings have a long spans, and therefore the embodied carbon in terms of that inevitably there will be included some sort of steel work or maybe some concrete in there. So hence that's why it's 50%, and that's before offsetting. Potable water use, you can see there it's a 40% reduction, and this health metrics as well. So as I said, this perhaps is the amount of information on the internet. There's just so much there, and I think it adds to the confusion. So what we've been trying to do this last year in terms of lockdown is actually work really closely with all the kind of key grassroots organisations and other professional bodies in the UK to actually speak with one voice. And really we've done an enormous amount of work. So we can see here that with UKGBC and working very closely with Letty, and all of these targets I've just given you are actually all aligned. And so really I think that wherever you come in, if you come in through the RBA or if you come in through any of these organisations, you will come to the same conclusion. And that's really important that we speak with one voice to all of you to make sure there's no confusion, but also to government to make sure that they listen to what we're saying. So as I said, the whole future here is this whole life carbon, and really the combination, as we see there, is the operational carbon, which is building energy use, and then you take off obviously on-site renewables, and then you offset that kind of sort of silver and the piece in the middle. Then you add the embodied carbon replacement in terms of say updating replacing the kit. And then you offset as one together. That is the whole life carbon, and that's it. We've all referenced the UKGBC, and there's a great piece of work ongoing just now, which is going to sort of create the timeline and the new benchmarks for that, but that's going to come out later this year. And in terms of actually assessing how we do this, we can see here that we've got a range of things, ranging from poor accuracy to good accuracy. Now, what we're saying to government, and it's not us, it's many of our kind of peers as well and professional bodies, is actually we've been urging government to ditch SAP and SBEM and move to more of a measurement verification system, like starting with passive house, but really moving up to TM54 in terms of larger buildings, and actually the better building partnership design for performance. That's actually where we can actually predict accurately, more accurately, the actual how buildings will actually use energy in terms of operation. So really it's a move that government, we're trying hard. We've written an open letter, as hopefully you've seen. 20 organisations have written that, and really we'll see how we get on, but ultimately we need to go faster. The government are kicking the can along to 2025, and we think that's too late. Right, so how do we do this kind of whole life carbon now? What is important in terms of the balance of operation and embodied? Now, we've resisted in terms of the RBA to create a single metric, because it's important that the next few years we understand the dynamics and the interrelationship between operation and embodied carbon. So this is a typical home. This is just a little kind of calculation I used using the 2030 challenge targets. So it's a 100 square meter building, say GIA. Now we've used a 30-year lifespan because actually, by 2050, our grid should be decarbonized. So after that point, then technically it is operational net zero. But obviously we've got still a long way to go there. The carbon factor of electricity is actually tumbling down because of our renewables just now, and we can see roundabout it's about the same as gas, about 0.2. So therefore that's kind of the basis of the study, and just using the 2030 challenge, we can see there. So the 2020 target, we see that the operational carbon is marginally more than the embodied, so but not much. It's almost kind of 50-50. But that flips when you sort of reduce the operational carbon down faster than the embodied. And we can see at 2025, the embodied carbon target sort of takes over. And then finally, the 2030 target is we've really attacked the operational side of things. And we can see there that really the embodied is more than the operation. I've given you an indication of actually how much tons of CO2 that would equate to for a single home, and we see the offsetting with a number of trees. Generally, it's about 5 trees per ton. But if you plant a really big oak, then that's really kind of quite exciting. You can really do some great stuff there. And I'd say fenland and peatland as well. So that's a typical home. Typical office, we can see here, same idea, again, really higher operational energy. We see there it's really quite significantly more in terms of operation at 2020. 2025, it's about 50-50, and we can see there the same thing, it flips to embodied carbon at 2030. So we've got to bear in mind how we build our buildings as well as but we still got to do both. Basically, we still got to achieve that operational reductions. Now the trees there, we see absolutely enormous amount of trees. So, but we're not suggesting that you're going to plant all these trees for every building. It's maybe a blend of actually sort of and really encouraging clients to kind of, instead of actually buying sort of global carbon credits, actually to really invest in local renewable sort of projects. And it's all about regional and local, and really helping to accelerate the decarbonisation of the grid. So it's a kind of win-win for the UK. So can we achieve these targets? Is this impossible? How can we do it? I'm going to give a few examples of where some of our colleagues, which have done some amazing things, and they've achieved this 2030 challenge already. So it gives us all hope, and really sort of puts the spotlight onto myself and my practice and other practice to really sort of step up and really do as well as some of these guys. So here we go. This is the first one. So this is Retrofit, as we talked about, 27 million homes to retrofit in 30 years. The government haven't really helped things in terms of, we haven't really got this kind of Green Deal sorted yet. They've pulled all the grants again, so hopefully that's going to come back in some other form. But in the meantime, in despite of this, we've got Energy Strong from the Netherlands, and they're building some fantastic examples in Nottingham. This is one example, so we can see the existing home to the right, what it looked like. Probably a very kind of sort of thin cavity, not much insulation. With overcladding, we can see here this is a passive house version, which actually achieves that whole. It's a passive house plus. It achieves that kind of net zero sort of refurbishment to that home, and again lifting again no bills from this in terms of that once you've just done your initial capital cost. So great work there. So keep an eye on Energy Strong. Then moving into a new build. So this is a fantastic building. It's Justin Beer. And this is obviously for a one-off client in a lovely part of the world. And now it's Passive House Plus again. So Passive House, really very high insulation and air tightness, thermal bridging, and obviously the form factor of the building is very simple building. But when you actually compile that with a really efficient thermal recovery system plus PV, then we can see here, this is the actual data, is actually it's producing more energy than it uses. And we can see that's actually using to power the electric car of this client. But we need to scale this up. So this is the 2019 Sterling Prize winning scheme, Mikkel Ritchie's fantastic scheme. I had the opportunity to visit that when judging. And we can see there that's a passive house scheme with no renewables, so there's no PV on this. And we can see it hits our 2030 challenge, both on operation and almost on the embodied carbon side, without really kind of sort of trying, really. This is kind of post-analysis, post-match analysis. This was done for £180 a square foot construction cost, which really shows that actually with a scale and economy of scale, we think we can do this. Moving up a scale, this is again Archetype. This is a primary school, a passive house primary school, and now Archetype have been working with passive house for a number of years. And we can see here the data. This is actual energy data. This hits our 2030 challenge bang on, 55 kilowatt hour per square meter, which is fantastic, and it's a beautiful school as well. Moving up a scale, Archetype again in Norwich. This is the best performing university and non-domestic building in the last few years. We can see it hits 70 kilowatt hours per square meter, but that's without renewables and without heat pumps. If you add both of those in, then actually it would actually hit our 2030 challenge as well. And yes, that is straw on the facade there. Then moving up to final scale really is showing that the more complex buildings, this says that Everyman, which won the Sterling Prize about 10 years ago. Now, this is a case point. This is actually a most complex building, which generally takes mechanical ventilation to do it. But the architect did this naturally ventilated with the engineers, and really used, you can see there in terms of through the glass, but the reused existing brick on site. So again, did think about the embodied carbon side of things as well. So really, the net result is actually won the Sterling Prize. It's a fantastic, beautiful building, but actually it performs as well. Now, what we're doing is we're changing the RB awards so that they align with the 2030 challenge, so that in 10 years' time, no project will win the Sterling Prize unless it can deliver that net zero ambition as well. So in conclusion, we've got 10 years. What do we need to do? And this is your takeaway, 10 things which you could consider. First thing is you've got to agree your sustainable outcomes with your clients. Think to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also use some of our metrics as a starting point. Think about the circular economy. It's retrofit, recycle, and then design for disassembly. Design for net zero performance, as we talked about. Increase biodiversity by 20% net gain. Low embodied, healthy materials, absolutely fundamental. And really, that's going to be the next thing that we're really going to focus on in terms of embodied carbon. Well-building principles, we talked about daylight, indoor air quality. Passive design is where it all starts. Fabric first approach, and then passive house level of envelope performance. Think about working with natural systems very carefully. Don't make buildings so complicated, but then integrate, sort of fine tune with engineering. And really, it's a step change, really urging everyone to kind of ditch fossil fuels now in all your new buildings, and then go for full electric. And finally, plan for use, design to close the loop and carry out some POE. Thanks very much.
Absolutely fantastic presentation there from Gary. Never ever get bored of seeing his presentations. Very, very clear passion for making the Earth a better place, particularly around the built environment, but also an absolutely fantastic way of communicating this in terms that are quite easy to understand for often what can be quite a complex topic. We're now going to move to the panel session. This was recorded, as I mentioned in the intro earlier, back at the CLS event, and it was hosted by MBS's Richard Waterhouse. And it's got a panel of 4 industry professionals with some very, very interesting debate. Again, I'll do a review and a summary at the end of this, but let's move on. And here's the panel session. Thank you.
But I'm delighted you're not going to be the only one who will be answering those questions. We've got a great panel for this session. So we got one more to come. I think we've got Scott still to come. So just while we're waiting for Scott to come on, I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. Gary, we know who you are. Taleen, do you want to just do a bit of an introduction?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Taleen Josefsson. I'm a Thrive project manager at Chetwoods, and I am a registered US architect, obviously working in London, passive house designer and content creator.
Fantastic. Thank you. Judit.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Judit Kimpian, and I chair the Sustainable Architecture Work Group for the Architects Council of Europe. I also contribute to the work of the World GBC's European Leaders Forum and teach Net Zero Retrofit, and I'm in the middle of developing a masterclass at UCL.
Fantastic. And Scott?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Blance. I'm a policy advisor at the Sustainable Energy Association, which is a trade group forming manufacturers, social housing organisations, consultancies like the BRE, and we specialise in engaging with government on the policy landscape for making buildings fit for the future.
Fantastic. So just a reminder to everybody, please use the Q&A feature. If there are questions you would like the panel to answer, we'll get to it. We've already had quite a few on there. I want to just come back to one that's always been a question for me around is it a fudge around carbon offsetting? So Gary, you gave us an example of different trees there, but does carbon offsetting actually get away from the core problem, which is the original design?
Well, if I just kick off and then I'll hand over to the panel. I think it's important to say that it's a grown-up conversation. So from the RBA, UKGPC and LETI, you've got to do your best. Okay, so it's actually setting that kind of best. That's 75%. And then allowing people to then say in our tight urban sites with high buildings, complex buildings, it's impossible to hit net zero in the city. So therefore, let's have a grown-up conversation saying we can offset. But the thing is, it's got to be gold standard offsetting. We can't actually have these kind of schemes that are going to be a waste of money. So it's about proper decarbonisation with forest, again, reconstruction of our landscape, but actually decarbonising, accelerating the decarbonisation of our grid. That's really important. So I'll hand over to the panelists there.
Judit?
I share Gary's view on this. We have to reduce demand first, and then meet that remaining demand with efficient systems. We haven't got enough energy at the moment in the system to decarbonize completely in the very short term. So there will have to be some amount of offsetting. But the idea is definitely start reducing demand first, address it with the remainder with efficient systems, and then look at supplying the remainder from sustainable sources.
And Taleen, same view for you?
I agree with what they said earlier, but I also am very skeptical of carbon offsetting. It should absolutely be the last resort. And I am aware that, well, there have been issues of double counting in the US, for example. I don't think that the same issue has been covered in the UK at all, but at the same time, it could be a wealth tax and kind of a get out of jail free card for some very rich companies, countries, and individuals. So I am very skeptical on that front. While I know that we need to greatly improve our buildings and then we can't make this all up immediately, we do need to be cognizant of that fact.
And Gary's already mentioned that today is World Earth Day. There's a big virtual conference starting in the US and will be a precursor to obviously COP26 coming on later on this year. But another question is are governments truly committed to a change in sustainability when we still charge tax on sustainable initiatives, when it costs more to retrofit but through taxation than it does in terms of new builds? Scott, is this a sensible way forward for government?
I think the government is starting to grasp the nettle around energy use in buildings, but historically there has been so much chopping and changing of policies, particularly as regarding the retrofit, and recently with the Green Homes Grant being the sort of prime example, that I think industry just wants that certainty. So from a policy point of view, the heat and building strategy is the big document that's supposed to be coming out at the end of Q2, that will hopefully set that long-term framework. But I think the shoots are encouraging. There's a couple of things to probably draw out on that. One would be that certainly I think the government is starting to address things through the building regulations. So the Future Homes and Building Standard will, transform that and enable that shift to electrified heating, and provide those regulations around fabric standards. There's also a new requirement to mitigate overheating, which is a progressive sign from the UK government. And I think possibly the other encouraging thing to say is that the government are starting to take more of a holistic approach to energy use in buildings through mandating adherence to standards like PAS 2035 for retrofit, their own fuel poverty schemes like ECO, or shifting towards a multiple measure approach. So not just looking at putting on external wall insulation, but doing structural repairs, fabric upgrades, ventilation, and installing a low carbon heating system in one intervention. So future-proofing that home for 2050 and a net zero world. So I think the government is moving in the right direction, particularly in new build, but there's still a long way to go in retrofit. And I think we forget that 80% of the homes that we will live in 2050 in the UK have already been built. So I think there's still a lot to go at in terms of retrofit and driving that market.
Richard, can I just chip in with one thing?
Yeah, let's get it. Yep.
So there's an open letter that has been written. Now, Scott's right. I think it's great, and setting themselves targets is absolutely fantastic, but they've got to follow through. Now we're a bit concerned about the lack of detail in terms of, and the lack of really ambition in terms of reducing energy demand. It looks like they're going to put everything into building wind generators in the North Sea, which isn't, that's part of the answer, but you can't do that. So if I could be bold, Richard, if I can sort of send that letter to you and then share it with everybody on this call, and then really what we're asking is write to the Minister of State. Now the actual the consultation's closed, but actually that minister should really understand the strength of feeling on this. So I'll send that afterwards, Richard.
I think one thing that we've seen with the European football debacle is that people power can make a difference. And I think, you know, we all believe that we've got to make a change. Things have to be different. We can't do what we've done in the past. And it's great to see the RIBA taking some leadership of the things you were showing in the presentation around that leadership. Also linking that to Wellbeing and the RIBA having this strategy around both the requirements for sustainable design and be able to demonstrate competency around that, but also bringing well-being. These are all great initiatives. But I do wonder, does this change the way we think about architecture? So you know, the oft-quoted line, the greenest building is an existing building. Does this mean we should challenge ourselves to stop building new?
So
you did.
Yeah. We should absolutely challenge ourselves about building new, and I think interesting about people power, we have started or some colleagues have started a petition that I shared widely about really simple incentives like changing the VAT on retrofit versus new build. So at the moment we're being charged 20% VAT on retrofit, whereas new build is only liable for 5%, and that should be utterly the other way around. I think you asked about well-being. I think to help people power grow, I think so architects can make a huge difference in just visualizing what this change represents in terms of quality of life and the way in which we live in a greener, friendlier environment that's healthier and much more productive. So we have a huge responsibility there. And it's a very important way to take the public with us. We always say, you know, net zero doesn't guarantee architectural quality, but architecture can scale up or mainstream net zero.
Yeah. Taleen, in terms of Chetwoods, is this a challenge? Is this reuse or is this new build? Where do you get that balance?
Well, I'm personally a very big proponent of reuse. That's what I actually did my master's thesis on. So that is very close to my heart. The issue with actually reusing materials, if you have to build new and you are reusing materials or you're maintaining a building, is that many of the labor costs as well as the materials are actually more expensive to deconstruct, clean, repair, and then reassemble or put in a new building, and not to mention the storage costs. Then if you're buying new products, for example, shipping a new product from China, where you have minimized costs, everything is very efficient. So we don't have that business model right now. And I think personally, I think that's a big barrier to providing economically available reuse in terms of completely like reusing a building versus reusing building components. But in regards to health and well-being, one of the things that we do consider at Chetwoods when we're talking about reuse is that we also have to consider the material content of the building materials, and to make sure that if we're in older buildings, for example, ones done in the 80s, 90s, 70s even, where there are unhealthy materials in there, we do need to take that into account as soon as possible, because it does impact, for example, the endocrine systems of humans, impacting fertility, for example, amongst a number of other issues. So there are multiple factors.
And that brings back that whole well-being issue. But Gary, a question that's just come in from Sophie there, just talking of existing buildings, what about listed buildings? What do we do? Because there's a carbon problem there as well. How do you treat that?
So I think this is where, again, another grown-up conversation, and it's really what I say is the building will tell you how far it needs to go without actually sort of complicating things. Okay, so really a listed building, again, it's like you know, I think we've got to relax, and I think that it's basically other buildings and the other supply chain should take up the strain. So, but generally, sort of what we, you know, in terms of the analysis, that Letty doing some fantastic work, but really it kind of balances down for me. Is maybe reduce it down by maybe 50% as your upper limit, and you're doing sensible things, but you're not going to do too far. But then it's maybe sort of more load in terms of ground source heat pumps and things like that. So decarbonising the kind of heating system, for instance. But actually, some of our just to say, I'm a big did my research into Victorian ventilation systems, and actually our Victorian buildings are actually the most beautifully put together environmental sustainable buildings, and it's just the heating part of it is actually was the problem. So really encourage that. But lime plaster as well, you know, there's a whole thing we could go into there. But yeah, just the building will tell you how far you need to go.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the themes that's come through the conference yesterday, and I think we'll see more today, is about using data to help drive decision making. And one of the things around data is data in use. So how long, I've got to say, I love seeing presentations around this where you see the exemplars of what is possible and what can be achieved by doing this well. How long before we get that data publicly available, and where do we go to get that data to see to challenge ourselves as to what we should be striving to achieve with our clients?
Richard, if Judith goes first, and then I'll come in afterwards. Yeah.
So yes, data is crucial, and also data literacy is crucial. So actually, there isn't that much that we need to know as non-designers of technical systems. And we have just actually finished a book together with Hetty Hartman and Sophie Pausmakers, which I'll share the link with you. We're launching it actually this evening, so you're all very welcome to join, follow the link.
I think we've put a link onto the main chat page for you as well. So yeah, absolutely.
But so data is absolutely critical, and it's, as you say, it's very important to have operational data. So if you think about cars and the Dieselgate scandal, we used to, so when you're looking at in-lab performance, which is what we currently plan for and specify, you're missing what occupants end up doing in the building, and also you're missing a level of quality control or accountability that gives power to architects and clients to actually ensure that they get the value for the money that they invested. So having operational data is critical. We have been campaigning, and you know very well that together with the RIBA and CIBSE, industry partners, including myself, set up the first crowdsourced data platform to help compare calculated and achieved performance. But now with digital technologies becoming and smart metering becoming really mainstream, we just need a few little tweaks in the legislation, which the RIBA and CIBSE and other institutions are campaigning for very hard. There's also a big campaign ongoing on the European Commission, whose rules we are not exactly. We're still roughly following what's happening there for at least some time. So any change about targeting measured performance in use is really the key. And yes, we're looking forward to seeing the changes in policy there, but there's nothing stopping for the time being projects and clients implementing operational targets in their projects and briefs, and starting right from the start. So implementing these at the beginning and following them through until the building is in use is the best way to get quality, and you'll see the proof of that in the book behind me.
Yeah. So Richard, if I just dip in, so that just to give the update of the plan in the RBA. So basically, that we will be doing some upskilling. So there'll be some CPDs that are being written this year and hopefully released next year. When the RBA feel that the profession is suitably upskilled, and we talked about that competency thing, which is going to come through, then really that's where the mandation of the light touch POE comes in. And that's where actually all chartered architects, which should actually, as part of their service, actually read the meters. Okay, so this is coming, so be prepared, everyone. But in terms of, despite all of this, what we're doing with CIBSE is actually all the awards are now asking for operational data. So actually what's going to happen is you won't win the Sterling Prize unless you give RBA and CIBSE your data. So that's a big change. That's what's happened this year. And hopefully that's going to drive change. We're working with UCL and others to then capture all that data in terms of a common protocol. And then that's where the building on Judith's carbon buzz, that's where actually we're going to capture so much data in the forward piece. But really everybody on this call has got to help us.
And yeah, 10 years ago, of course, the carbon buzz, it showed us there was this huge gap, didn't it? So it's great to see we are making progress. But Taleen, it's not just about that sustainability, it's data on well-being as well. So are there other things that we ought to be putting into these data sets that will help us guide in terms of design principles?
Absolutely. It's not just well-being metrics that we're trying to achieve as well, or just track. It's biodiversity net gain metrics, social value, the embodied carbon factor, which is very, I guess, a hot topic right now. I know that there's a lot of discussion about where is the most, I guess, reliable source of embodied carbon data. So we use the ICE database from Circular Ecology, Dr. Craig Jones. And then also that kind of information is available in third-party verified EPDs. So we use that as a good source, reliable source of embodied carbon data, which we really do need to track. I know Gary had mentioned that earlier in his presentation as well. But then we also have a lot of other questions that we need to have readily available from manufacturers as designers so that we actually know what we're specifying in our buildings. This is actually something that I did a CPD for NBS about back in February, where at Chetwoods we ask all the manufacturers when we're going to specify material a whole list of questions that we just published yesterday, including who is making the material, where is it coming from, are there fair wages and living wage paid, questions about equality and both, I guess, gender equality in that regard, as well as material content. Material content is something that we're really, really pushing, and we need to have more transparency from manufacturers about, because that is directly linked to our well-being as users of the building, but also the well-being of the environment.
I think we'll talk about manufacturers in a second, but that whole process of specifying, we've talked before about the 3 C's of specifying, in that compliance is fundamental. Whatever the product or system is, it has to do its job. Then obviously one of the next factors on decision making is cost. But I think where we're going is saying there's this 3rd C of carbon. And we probably ought to expand that to include other areas as well. But fundamentally, it's got to be part of the decision-making process on any product or system. So, Taleen, you've already given us some comments, but what else do manufacturers do? Gary, in terms of the manufacturing community, what do you want to see to help you achieve your objectives?
So I think it's picking up at Taleen's point. It's the EPDs. So I think there's they're growing in Europe. I think Britain, maybe our kind of manufacturers are lagging behind a little bit. So I think we're up to 10,000 or so worldwide. It gives us the confidence. It needs to be independently checked, but it gives the specifiers the confidence that we know what's in the product. And it's really, the analogy here is in terms of food, and really it's the provenance. We need to understand, and really the more we put onus on our designers in terms of specification, that's going to trickle down. So what I'd say is that do it now, because it's really putting everybody on a watch. In terms of supply chain, we will be asking for that data, and actually that really comes down to, in terms of when we work with the client in terms of our sustainable outcomes, that's going to lock in huge changes downstream. So you've got to get ready.
So let's come back to Oh, sorry, you're going to say something.
I was just going to add something to that. So one of the major, the most important multipliers that's underpinning whole life carbon impact is lifespan. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. So the mechanism for collecting and managing this data is through the bill of materials. And we're beginning, more and more practices are beginning to automate the generation of this bill of materials alongside bills of quantities. And then we can attach different kinds of data to that, whether it's lifespan data, whether it's maintenance cycle data, whether it's durability, whether it's recycled content or embodied carbon, wherever we have it available. And different clients will ask for different levels of disclosure. But the lifespan and durability and maintenance cycles and recycled contents are all things that are already available and have the biggest impact on the whole life performance of buildings. So one of the things that this whole life approach is trying to shift is to go from a short-term investment cycle to a much longer-term investment cycle, and lifespan is obviously critical in that.
And across NBS, of course, there are so many opportunities for specifiers to put in some of those requirements, such as recyclable content, etc. For manufacturers, we can already collect information and show to specifiers the information that manufacturers have, but it is going to come back to some form of consistent measure, isn't it, to ensure that we're not getting the greenwash that might appear in some claims. And of course, later on the manufacturer stream today, we're going to hear from Adam Turk about the new code around marketing for products, including safety, but also looking at declarations of other things. So for the manufacturing stream, you'll see that later on this morning. I do want to come back to governments, though, because governments can, through legislation, through targeting, through measures, they can change behaviour. And we've got a really big change coming up at the minute in terms of heat and the way that we will be heating our houses in the future. So, Scott, in terms of the changes that are coming through, this is having quite a fundamental effect both on design but also on manufacturers as well, looking at what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly in new build, we're looking at the growth of heat pumps. I mean, Boris Johnson says he wants 600,000 a year by 2028, which is less than what's required, but is a good start. I think fundamentally that means a change to how we design heating systems, because certainly air source heat pumps operate best on with an ambient source of heat, so a low flow temperature heating system of 45 to 55 degrees. What that means in terms of your radiators, you have larger radiators and slightly different pipework. And there's also a massive consumer education challenge there as well, because you need to make consumers aware that it's a different form of heat. So you're not touching your hand against the radiator and burning. It's a more gradual form of heat. So that is going to lead to significant changes from a consumer point of view, and then also how we're sort of designing our buildings and ensuring that they have a good thermal envelope, because obviously the leakier the building, the less efficient the heat pump will be to run.
And kind of following on from that, we mentioned a little bit earlier about the changes that government have brought in recently to the grant system, to the funds available, because as you say, when you change the heating system, you move to any form of heat pump system, super insulating the building then becomes really quite important, and that can be quite disruptive.
Yeah, it can be. So I think that's why the government have tried to move to incentivize more of a multiple measure approach, because if you're doing the fabric and the heating system at the same time, it's less interventions. And I think in terms of incentives, they've realized that the current incentives for consumers is something called the renewable heat incentive, which is coming to a close, but that will be replaced next year by the Clean Heat Grant, which is an upfront £4,000 grant, and that will hopefully address some of the cost barriers, certainly for homeowners, that exist around air source and ground source heat pumps, because they are currently more expensive than a boiler. So hopefully having that more progressive funding model of giving an upfront grant rather than a repayments over time, which is what the RHI is going to help drive some of that deployment on the retrofit side as well as on the new build side. But I think there's a consumer education piece, and then there's a skills piece as well, to ensure that we have the heating engineers that are appropriately trained to install and have that conversation with the consumer.
Yeah, Richard, I'll just chip in a couple of things. I think we talked about this earlier on today. It's really the presentation obviously we gave is all about strategic big moves. There's a lot of big buildings in there with a full supply chain and engineers to really can help us. But really I'm sure the vast majority of architects were in, small practices, and we're doing domestic work with not the luxury of having amazing engineers to work with. It's really important that actually we upskill our profession, and that's really a priority of all of us, and this is why we're all doing these things. And picking up Scott's point in terms of the architect really being, with kind of other professions, but really architect really kind of being central to this kind of refurbishment of our existing building stock. And so I think I'm trying to encourage the RBA to really force the government to say, right, you need professionals there to then think about how we retrofit buildings, because all the problems of the putting insulation into things which shouldn't have insulation in, and all the problems ripping it all out, the stories we hear about is just dreadful. That needs to be considered holistically. So this is why it's so important that we can't just, and I can see the writing on the wall, unfortunately. I can see this kind of big thing. Yeah, it's an easy decision. Let's just change all the heat pumps. Let's go for it. Yeah, $1 billion, but then they'll miss the problem. And it's the problem, you've got to look at the whole building.
And you did that came through with Carbon Buzz, as you say. It's about how you use the building as well, not just about the individual pieces. You've got to put all these pieces together to get the whole picture.
Yes, just to follow on from Gary's point, once you take all the finishes off the wall, it's important to reconfigure the space to make it more functional and more valuable. So adding environmental and energy and efficiency measures don't raise the building's value. Reconfiguring it and making it more livable and healthier is a win-win for everyone. We should not be retrofitting without upgrading the building's functionality and architecture, and at the same time we should not be retrofitting architecture without upgrading the performance. And getting rid of that 20% VAT for the price of guaranteeing performance uplift would be a really good measure to start with. Taleen,
As Gary said, governments, the UK government has changed its targets, and it's fine changing the targets, but we've got to start seeing some really tangible changes now that will help the industry move forward. Sorry, Taleen, go on, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch back on Gary's and Judith's point, is that in upskilling the profession, we've actually realized that there's a lot of work to do within architectural education at the very basic level, because a recent survey that was done by ACAN actually showed that 80% of students who responded to the survey felt their courses did not prepare them for the future work in light of the climate emergency. And that's not even including the actual working professionals who are in practice today. So there is a lot of work to be done. In addition to that, just the skills itself, we do need to be more inclusive of who we're having in the profession who's entering into our education system, because it's quite monotonous at the moment, and we need all that diversity, all those different skills working together. So many different points to be made also on architectural education.
And I think one thing that we know from our industry, it's very easy not to change. And we have to find the levers to get people to change. Valton was asking, is it just the RIBA or do other institutes, are they involved? Well, we've already heard CIBSE are really good at this. Dan's asking the question, should CIAT, should the technologists have a role? I think this is for everybody, isn't it? We all have a role to play in this. We're running out of time, so I just want to come on to a little bit of looking at the future now. What would you like to see in the future? So in the short term, in the next couple of years, what are the things we need to focus on that are actually going to see positive progress? Scott, I'm going to come to you first.
Improved metrics, I think, would be a great start. I mean, so Judith and Gary touched on in-use performance and addressing the performance gap, and I think that's got to be up front and center when we're looking at buildings and how we can bring in technologies that the government have been sponsoring through the SMETR program and starting to bring those to account to make EPCs or whatever succeeds them fit for purpose. I think that's a really thing, especially when you're looking at the operational side of the building. And then I think addressing some of the skills gaps we currently have. I think we sometimes underestimate how much of a job this is going to be. The CITB published a report recently around the skills requirements just in the construction sector, and estimated there'd be something like 350,000 additional workers that be required, I think, by 2030. So I think we need to have we have to look at this in terms of a green recovery. That's the government's buzzword. So we need to look at this in terms of how we're going to transition people into these jobs of the future. And then I think finally just putting in some long-term policy certainty, as I'll wave my flag and say we need some of this in writing, in legislation. Perfect.
Judit.
So you stole my thunder, Scott. Yeah, so I would say 3 things: innovate, validate, and renovate. And I think it's a really important point to make about feedback, that you cannot innovate without feedback fast enough. Natural selection has a very high failure rate, and we definitely do not want to mimic that natural cycle. We want to innovate without the pain, and feedback is the best way to accelerate that and make it joyful.
Wonderful. Spreading the joy with Taleen.
So I'll also give 3 points that I'd like to see in the future, or I expect to see. We need that to consider more than just the economic cost of our buildings and materials. It's also the cost of the economy, the social cost, the ecology and social cost. Then the second thing is we need to see diversity within the profession of architecture that actually reflects the diversity of the population. And third, we need to demand transparency and cooperation across the construction sector, whether it be from manufacturers, our fellow architecture firms, policymakers, etc.
We started with Gary, so it's right that we finish with it. Gary.
Okay, I'm going to be very quick. First off is Boris has got to read our letter, open letter, and he's got to act on it. There's no delay. So Boris, if you're listening, read the letter. And then to all the practitioners there, is really make that first step. Really, you've got to have a go and really sort of think about the project on your board at this moment, and then try. Okay, just you've got to go for it. Thanks.
Perfect. On behalf of everybody watching, thank you to our panel. That has been really, really interesting. I think we might want to do something like this, specifically around this whole sustainable green agenda.
I hope everybody enjoyed the panel session. I found it really, really thought-provoking, and it really ties in nicely and carried on to what Gary was just discussing in his presentation prior to this. Just going to do a little bit of a wrap-up and a summary, so a little bit of review of what we've just heard. Let's start really with Gary's presentation and the key statistics that he did there. I mean, the stark thing is the 37 billion tons of CO2 that as a human species we are emitting into the atmosphere, and the fact that a third of that comes from buildings. When it's put into context that the Earth can only absorb half of that, it really, really puts the picture into clarity as to what's going on and addresses the reason why we need to do something. So Gary noted that we need to achieve a 1.5 degree limit in increase in temperature. This is something that's quite critical, because unless we don't do something about this, we're going to come 2050 see this 4 degrees plus increase in temperature, which might not sound that drastic, but it will cause many, many places to be uninhabitable. People won't be able to live there, and by default we'll see more immigration, people moving, cities becoming overcrowded, more energy use for regards to things like air conditioning, keeping things cool and so forth. So we really, really need to do more, and we can do more. As Gary noted, the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes is made up of 8 key points. These are net zero operational carbon. To do that, really, we need to focus on retrofit, not just new build. Then there's net zero embodied energy. This is obviously focusing on the materials, etc., that go into the buildings that we're making, and making sure that we are specifying and utilizing products correctly. There's then the sustainable water cycle. This is something that can quite often get overlooked when we're talking about climate change. But if you think of all these people maybe moving to cities, there's only going to be so much possible water per person, so we have to restrict what each person can have. The also thing is the energy consumption that goes into actually processing water in filtration plants and so forth is really, really high. So we need to do more about the water use that we do. Sustainable connectivity and transport. If anything that the past year has taught us is that we can reduce the amount of travel that we do and still see success. So we need to really focus on that as well. And that's part of the master planning, etc. within architectural design is going to focus on this as well. Sustainable land use and ecology goes without saying, making things greener, better for nature, better for the environment, and nicer outdoor spaces really for us to enjoy, which really leads on to that good health and well-being, having that connectivity to the outside, but ultimately improving people's mental health. Buildings can have quite a great impact on that, but also our physical health as well. So reducing the volatile organic compounds that are within different products, etc., that are selected for use within a building, and making sure that the air quality and so forth is great. Then there's sustainable communities and social values. Again, this is something that we all need to be part of. We are all part of communities, and we should all have social values, and we can do a lot better than we do now, but there are some great people making headway there. The MBS has some great processes in regards to this as well. So if anybody would like to know more, just drop us a note on that. And then sustainable life cycle cost. And this is ultimately about the cost of things not being about the bottom dollar, so to speak. It's about that whole life value cost. And obviously the cost to the planet is a key thing there as well. Moving into the panel session, we were asked quite a few questions. Richard's always absolutely brilliant at coming up with these questions and provoking quite a great conversation. Going to the first one where he was discussing carbon offsetting and the actual practicalities around it. I think the message that we got there is that people need to do the best. Ultimately, we need to just reduce, going to the 3 R's of recycling. Reduce is absolutely the #1 paramount thing to do. We need to reduce the amount of energy that we consume and reduce the amount of emissions that we're emitting. But if you can't do that, obviously there's going to be times when emissions are absolutely inescapable. Then making sure that you're using a gold standard for carbon offsetting is going to help you a lot. It should be the last resort, really. And I think, as Taleen from Chetwoods mentioned, is carbon offsetting isn't a get out of jail free card, which a lot of people will be viewing it as on their claims to net zero. But it should be done as an absolute bare minimum if you can't do anything else. And talking about what the governments are doing, the governments are making a lot of headway now with sustainability, and you're seeing quite a lot in the press. Obviously, fire safety has taken a big headline in the construction sector over the past few years, and obviously the pandemic has taken up a lot of the space over the past year and a half as well. But with COP26 around the corner and the UK hosting that, sustainability is now right bang at the forefront again. And the realizations there, I think, from everybody that now is the time to act. If we don't do something now, then we're going to be in a really, really bad place moving forward. We're starting to get some focus and some strategies around different frameworks that the government are putting in place to help the construction sector. But there does seem to still be that feel around it's focusing on new build and not so much retrofit. And as we've heard through the themes, through the topic and Gary's presentation, we need to be reusing the building stock that we already have and not necessarily just building new. So there's going to be more coming from there. We heard from Scott, who mentioned about there's going to be the new green heating grants, etc., that are coming. So hopefully we're going to see a lot better sort of options for people to actually renovate and improve the current homes and so forth. Then went on to talk about how does data help. MBS are obviously big advocate for digital data. It's what our core sort of products are based around. But I think with sustainability, as well as being able to specify, select and design with more sustainable materials and design more sustainable buildings through better passive measures and so forth, the focus on real life use seemed to crop up quite a lot within the panel session. And as Judit mentioned, she compared it to the Dieselgate scandal, is that people are making claims that are lab test results or the theoretical, they're based on calculations from a simulation. So gathering real life data of what's actually going on within buildings when it's in use and it's handed over to the end client is going to help feed that. Gary noted that obviously this type of data being driven is going to influence things such as the Sterling Prize moving forward, is that to be eligible to win, people are going to have to prove that they have been collecting this information and they've been utilising it to show their green credentials and the design's green credentials more importantly. we then moved on and started to discuss what do manufacturers need to do. Obviously, this goes along with pretty much everything else, whether it's fire safety, whether it's operational side of things, or whether it's sustainability. The buildings are all built with manufacturers' products and systems. So without them providing the means to an end, the whole thing doesn't work. So what did the manufacturers need to do? Well, environmental product declarations, or EPDs, was the big one, making sure that specifiers have got the confidence to know what the products contain, how they've been manufactured, how they're going to perform from a sustainability point of view in a true and unambiguous way. They need to know this, and you need to be providing this. Again, MBS Source is on a route to help with that, and if any manufacturers that are listening to this want to know more, please drop us a note. We've actually got a dedicated sustainability section now within the data sets for all the MBS properties, but ultimately it's down to you guys. You really need to do what you can to show your green credentials, but bit of a caveat: avoid the greenwashing. Read in the news this week that the CMA are looking at producing a code that helps manufacturers to avoid the greenwashing, to make sure that sustainable claims are accurate and clear and ambiguous. Very similar to what the CPA are doing with the Code for Construction Product Information. So this is coming. Specifiers are going to be demanding this information, and you need to provide it. So again, now is the time to act. We then spoke very briefly about heating changes and the need to remove predominantly what we are doing as fossil fuel burning heaters, etc., within our homes, looking at ground source heat pumps, electrical, renewable energy, that kind of thing. And we're going to need some incentive, really. I think the theme from what most people are saying from the government, for people to do that. So the next 10, 15 years is going to see quite a significant shift, I think, within that particular component sector. So on that note, there's quite a lot of things that have been going on in the industry, but sustainability, I think, for me, from what we've seen at the Construction Leaders Summit, what we're seeing in the press at the moment, what we're hearing from government in the news and so forth, is the number one focus, and quite rightly so. Most of these things that have been going on, whether it's fire safety or whether it's sustainability, is all about saving lives. With sustainability, obviously, saving the planet is going to help save lives, and it's going to protect the earth and the places where we live for our generations to come. So we hope everybody's enjoyed those presentations. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop us a note. If you'd like to know more about the MBS platforms, just a little bit of a recap as to what those are. MBS provide RIBACPD.com. We're associated with the RIBA in provision of CPD. Any architects, designers, etc., listening to this, obviously this is a great go-to source to listen to the CPDs. For any manufacturers, if you're considering CPD provision as part of your marketing strategy, particularly in light of the sustainability measures that we've just been discussing, feel free to drop us a note. We then have MBS Source. This was a new website that was launched at the beginning of last year, and it replaced the National BIM Library, MBS Plus, and RIBA Product Selector, for anybody that was familiar with those. And it's a one-stop shop to go and research, select, and look at and compare thousands and thousands of different construction products. That in itself is then ultimately linked to MBS Chorus. MBS Chorus is our award-winning cloud-based specification tool. It's available to both specifiers and manufacturers, and you can quite easily create specifications in both the common arrangement work sections or Uniclass. And it's fully connected to MBS Chorus to allow manufacturers' products to be instantly dropped. So USP there for MBS, for any manufacturers that are listening, you can get your product seen on a search engine, but only MBS Chorus can actually get you into the spec. On that note, I'd like to say thank you very much. If you've got any queries surrounding MBS Chorus, MBS Source, or any of the sustainability measures that you've heard about in the presentation today, you can hear a lot more at the mbs.com. We've got loads of great news articles, knowledge papers, that kind of thing, and other webinars along the same subject. Or feel free to give us a call or drop us an email on the information on the screen. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.